Good evening. It is Thursday, March 2nd, 2023 at 6 o'clock p.m. We are at the District Service Center in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. We'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the land of the Minnewacan Dakota people. Minnewacan means dwellers of the Spirit Lake. Our first item on the agenda is 1.0, and that is our roll call. Mr. Lawrence. Here. Next is 2.0, and that is our Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Next, we have the approval of the agenda. Could I get a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Moved by Simi and seconded by Eric. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Next is our workshop items, and that will be 4.1, and that is tonight, Teaching and Learning Services, highlighting science, and that will be introduced by our Assistant Superintendent, Kelly Jansen.
All right, good evening. I am honored to work with the groups, the folks you see at the end of the table. Post-pandemic, the review of standards and everything has taken a different pace. Previously, it was every couple years one of the core subjects would come, but the Department of Education kind of put things on hold through the pandemic, and so they have been working really hard at some of the most important subjects that we teach. English, math, reading, science, social studies are all kind of coming bam, bam, bam. So we will do our best to come in when there are no school showcases. We will bring teaching and learning to kind of give the board some reports on where we are with standards and instruction review, which is our CIRC process, which you're going to hear tonight from Ian Bronson, who's our supervisor that's been working with our teacher teams, and then our secondary director of teaching and learning, Tia Clasen, and our elementary director of teaching and learning, Arthur Williams. So I will turn it over to them.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So just an agenda for our time together. We are going to go over the context for K-12 science. We're going to look at the CIRC process and the objectives of the process. We're going to look at the composition of the CIRC teams. For science, we had 3 teams. We had a K-5 team, a 6-8 team, and a 9-12 team. So you'll get to hear a little bit about each of those teams and the work that they have done so far. You might be asking, what's happening now? That's a great question. Ian will answer that for you. And then you'll see our implementation timelines and what they look like at each of the levels, and then we'll provide you an opportunity to ask us any questions that you may have.
Good evening, everybody. So to start us off, and it really is going to be Mr. Bronson's show tonight, we just want to remind you that the new standards in science came out in 2019. They were adopted in 2019. The number of benchmarks that are aligned to the standards were reduced from the number in 2019. The focus of the shifts is really on instructional practice, student exploration, student argumentation from evidence, and critical thinking. And then finally, you see that the MCA 4 goes into effect for the 24-25 school year, which is the first full year of implementation for K-12 science. And just a reminder about the MCA 4, I think I brought this to a previous meeting. The MCA 4 in science will have a writing component, and they have included a writing component because of the strong focus on argument from evidence, and you can't really do that with a multiple choice test. Is it on now? I'm pushing.
Oh, you're on. That's great. Yeah, you're on. She's turned it on, yeah.
Can you hear me?
No.
Okay. The MCA 4 has a written component. It will be evaluated using artificial intelligence. And the testing that they have done on the AI has shown that the evaluation of that writing component is more objective than the human evaluation of the writing component, which is pretty interesting. So we've had a lot of fun with the teacher teams coming together to unpack the science standards and to take a look at what is expected of both teachers and students. And I'm going to turn it over to Ian.
Well, good afternoon. Am I on now? Let's try that. Good afternoon. Hopefully I do okay. I guess I got introduced 3 times. It's sort of fun. I don't think that's ever happened. But so, yeah, we're going to walk through really that context for K-12 science. And it's based on the next generation science standards. That's NGSS. So if you hear that around there, that's what it's from. That was a national look at how do we appropriately teach science to our students. And Minnesota used that, and that's based on what we call the 3 dimensions of science. And so on the next 3 slides, I'll walk through those 3 dimensions. I thought I'd start with sort of where we're probably more familiar, which is those disciplinary core ideas. Or really, you might think of it as the high school courses you might have taken a long time ago. The most traditional ones are, of course, life science or biology, and then physical science is chemistry or physics. There's a renewed emphasis now in the new Minnesota State Standards to look at earth and space science as well. And so you'll see that pop up. You'll notice on the far right side of that slide, they're also talking about science and engineering principles. As we think about preparing our students to go out into the real world, we want to make sure they are also understanding sort of that pragmatic approach to science. So those are those core disciplinary ideas. That is going to be dimension 1 of those 3 dimensions of science. And you heard Dr. Clasen talk about this a little bit. The second dimension of science is looking at what we call science and engineering principles. And these are 8 different principles that should show up and undergird all of science that we talk about with our students, K through 12. And you could think of it as sort of not boring scientific method, right? And so we're going to ask questions. We want all students to ask questions and be involved in that narrative process of asking questions. Along with that, defining problems. If you think about an engineering concept, you look at defining problems and not just asking questions. We're going to be developing models. We want students to be active in planning their investigations, not just doing a lab that's cookie cutter dumped on them. We want students involved in that process. We need to have them analyzing data, also using mathematical thinking, constructing explanations. And those last 3 here, we really talk about that narrative approach because we know that scientists need to be able to articulate what they learn about the natural world. And so we want to develop those skills in our students starting in kindergarten all the way through. So they need to be able to construct an explanation. They need to be able to argue from evidence. What do they observe in the world? How do they make a conclusion about that? And then be able to communicate that with their peers as well as with teachers and outside people. Our final dimension in those 3 dimensions is what we call cross-cutting concepts. And these are, you could think of as undergirding or the umbrella that all science falls underneath. So these should be explicitly taught at every level of science so that students begin to see patterns in the natural world. They can see the cause and effect. And so each of these 7 ideas should be present every time we talk about any of those core disciplinary ideas in science. People who go on in science, we recognize that science starts to converge more and more, right? If you're a biochemist, you don't just use biology, you use chemistry and use those physics processes as well. So we want to be able to prepare students for that type of thinking as they go through science. So those are 3 dimensions of science that undergird what we do in science. Now let's talk more explicitly about, there we go, what the SIRC team, so Standards and Instruction Review Cycle, what the objectives of those teams are. And we have so far done 3 different teams at the elementary level, middle school level, and high school level. First thing we want to do in that standard instruction review process is understand what the new standards are that Minnesota has given us. They were adopted in 2019. We want to prepare for our students taking the MCA4s in 24-25. So we have to sort of backwards design to make sure we're ready for that. Then we want to look at, if we have new standards, what instructional practices do we need in the classroom? How do we teach science, perhaps differently than we did a long time ago? So that's going to be a key there. The Minnesota State Standards call out earth and space science in 6th grade And so we're going to need to develop a new course for 6th grade, and we've already started implementing that right now in our middle schools. And then that will cause students to jump into physical science their 8th grade years. You'll see that in that last bullet point as well. And then middle school goes earth and space science, life science, then physical science. We're going to repeat that pattern when we get to high school, and so 9th grade will switch to earth and space science. Right now, 9th grade does physical science. So that change is coming. So we met last year, beginning in April, we reached out to all of our elementary schools and asked for teachers that were interested in looking at the new standards and how we might implement them. We had 26 members on that team, and we met after school most of the time. And then right away at the beginning of the summer, we spent 2 full days looking at and evaluating different resources. We had representation from almost all of our 16 elementary schools. We had a few principals on that team as well, a few EL teachers and a few special ed teachers. So we were trying to get the voice of as many teachers and staff that influence how science is taught at the elementary school. Next, we brought together a team of 6th through 8th grade teachers. That is a slightly smaller team, 11 members. We're meeting currently. So we started in October, and we will meet all the way through May. We have representations from every grade level at that middle school team, as well as some school administrators. And all 4 of our middle schools are represented on that team. And for them, it's a big shift, especially for 6th grade and 8th grade. And then, of course, there's the shift in approach or pedagogy as well for all grades, 6, 7, and 8. Then we move on to high school. And we are meeting right now as well. We have 18 members on that team representing 4 of our 5 high schools. And we have all 4 core science content areas. So right now that's physical science mainly for freshmen, biology, chemistry, and physics as well. The CERC process runs a little outside of what we do for AP or CIS courses, so if you have that question, that sort of falls outside. As the College Board updates standards, we will adopt those at that time. All right, so what have we accomplished so far? Elementary is a little further ahead, and so we looked at a variety of different resources. The TLS team, we met and looked at, I can't remember exactly, something like 15 different resources, and pared those down to 3 that we want our elementary school teachers and that CERC team to really review. And so they did a deep dive on those 3 resources, and we used a rubric that explored a variety of things, looking at equity, how is it going to implement with our current technology, et cetera. And they arrived at Discovery Education. So right now, our elementary school students are using Discovery Education as the core curriculum or curricular resource to address those science standards. Right now we are starting with 3rd grade, and so we have a 3rd grade scope and sequence, sort of what you're going to teach that's more granular, what you're going to teach, when you're going to teach throughout the year. That's been developed, and we'll talk a little bit about how that works when we talk about implementing. We move to middle school, and we are working right now, and middle school team made the determination last sort of the beginning of the summer, so last school year, that they would like to work with Discovery Ed as well. And so they have Discovery Ed at the middle school, so our students will be K through 8 with Discovery Education. And so really that team is looking at, through the CERC process, really explicitly at the instructional practices and the standards and how do we make sure we are teaching those at each level. I have up there 6+2 meetings, and someone gave me a hard time about that. Couldn't you just add that together, right? But the reality is we have 6 CERC meetings, which looks specifically at standards and instructional practices. We also have 2 meetings set up this year for planning what's going to actually happen, so that's scope and sequence meetings. So there's really a different objective for those. So we've already completed the 6th grade scope and sequence planning, and then there is one more coming up for 7th grade. And that really is where you get into that nitty-gritty. What are we going to teach in September? What are we going to teach in October? And our goal on that team is to make sure we are teaching equitably across all 4 of our school district, or middle schools in our school district. We want to make sure we're aligning that instruction in 6th grade, and so this year they're starting in 6th grade teaching earth and space science. And then high school, we are meeting as well, and there you see that 6+1, so we have 6 CIRC meetings set up, and we are progressing through those. We've completed 3 of them already. A few have been changed because we were going to meet on these beautiful snow days, and so we had to adjust for those. And then we'll have one 9th grade, because 9th grade will adopt the new standards next year for Earth and Space Science in 9th grade. So we'll have one planning meeting this year to make sure that those 9th grade teachers are prepared to jump in next year with that. This team is still looking at which resource we're going to adopt in our district. And so we've already looked at our rubric. We've been doing a deep dive into those standards and what instructional practices we want at each grade level or each content area. And then they will make that determination in the next couple meetings. And they've already started to look at 6 different resources that are available. And here's the fun part, which is how do we implement all this? So really, we look at that backwards design. We want to make sure that our students are ready to take the MCA tests in 24-25. So if you go backwards, we need to work with our 3rd grade teams this year. And we have what we call a soft adoption for our 3rd grade teams. And that really was being cognizant of the fact that this year, we're introducing a new ELA curriculum. And that's a pretty heavy load for elementary teachers. And so we said, hey, if you feel like you have the bandwidth and capacity to also do Discovery Ed with 3rd grade science, please feel free to do so. And most of our teachers are trying some of those things out as they go through the year to become more familiar with that. And that allows our students to at least start seeing science taught in a different way. You'll hear the word phenomenon, and that's where they look at a specific idea, something like a snowstorm. And so instead of teaching meteorology through like, hey, this is how the pattern works, we start with a snowstorm and say, hey, students, what do you notice? And then they start to dive into the questions about it, and as we're working through that process, we build in those science principles. And so that phenomenon base is what's working. Next year, we'll introduce 4th grade, and then that cohort of students will then be in 5th grade the following year, which will be 24-25, and they should be ready for the MCA 4s. Same pattern happens in middle school. So we're starting this year with 6th grade. Now, almost everyone has jumped in. So everyone jumped into Earth and Space Science in 6th grade. The soft adoption there is how much of Discovery Ed do you want to use or not. And so that we've left that to the teacher discretion a little bit more this year. We've now built that full scope and sequence, so the expectation is that more of those teachers are jumping in with Discovery Ed. Same idea. Next year we'll jump in with 7th grade, and then 2 years from now we'll jump in with 8th grade. When we get to high school, that MCA test tracks with biology, which most of our students take in their sophomore year. And so we had a little more leeway to start 1 year later at that level. And so next year we'll start with Earth and Space Science for our freshmen, and then the sophomores will take biology in 24-25, and that'll be when they take the MCA. Chemistry and physics will then follow. Wonderful. So, open up for questions or clarification. Yeah.
Yeah, a question about the science and engineering practices. Look very similar to the math practices that are part of Common Core. Are those also part of the standard, or is it something separate from the standard? Science and engineering.
So, this science and engineering practices are part of our Minnesota standards. Yes, they are written right into them, and if you get down to the numeral system, they're embedded in there. So every single benchmark that you see will be tied specifically to one of those SEPs.
Okay, I have a bunch, but that's not a surprise. So one of the questions I had was, so you say that 9th graders will take Earth Science next year, and then in 10th grade they'll take biology, 11th they'll take chemistry or physics, and then vice versa. So what happens to students who are interested in taking AP or IB? How does that work that they can get those classes in?
Well, brilliant question, and we've had that question a lot. And one of the things that's interesting is the 2009 standards for Minnesota asked for 3 years of credit in high school for science. Of those 3 years, life science was called out specifically, and 1 year of physical science. So that 3rd year requirement was left open. The new standards are specifically calling you have to have one of them as Earth and Space Science, one must be life science, which we usually think of as biology, and then that third one has to be physical science. So they're more explicitly calling out those 3 years, which then puts a little bit of a pressure on our students for that. And so it will be a little bit more challenging for students to have as many options at that AP or IB level. However, that physical science can be filled for chemistry or physics, and they could jump right into AP or IB. So
So
they can
instead of-
switch that out. Same thing with AP Bio if they wanted to.
So instead of doing, like, so I have a ninth grader who's taking biology. So instead of taking biology, a student coming in after taking earth science could theoretically then take AP Bio without having taken, and does that have an impact on the MCAs? Or if you're,
No, the AP courses will prepare any student to take any state level standardized test.
okay,
What MDE, how MDE calls it out is they say that the like AP and CIS and IB and concurrent enrollment go beyond the standards. So they, it's like they keep going down the track.
okay.
So an AP Bio class, and my son took AP Bio, and it prepared him quite well.
So if you're a 10th grader then taking AP Bio instead of regular biology, do you take the MCA, or, so you would still take the MCA? So the idea is that all 10th graders will take a science MCA because they are all theoretically taking some sort of biology class.
You take the MCA, you take the high school science MCA at the end of the year that you took life science, because the MCA 4 is mostly focused on life science.
Okay. And then one of the questions I had, so when I remember it used to be that 5th graders would take the MCA, and then it seems like how you did on the MCA determined which science class you were given in middle school. And so that's no longer a thing, correct? All students will take the same, okay. And then same at the high school, that there's no, like, the idea is that, so wait, one question. At the high school, is it still 3 years that they have to have, or, okay. And so at the high school, everyone is at least taking 9th grade, all 9th graders are taking the same thing and have the same kind of basis
All
of
9th
knowledge.
graders will take earth and space science. We are offering general earth and space science and honors earth and space science. And remember that at our high schools, it's self-select. So they can self-select into the honors earth and space science if they wish.
Okay. And then you're talking about elementary school, and what kind of, so what would be a sample lesson, for example, like for a 5th grader doing science? And is science going to be taught below 3rd grade? Because you said that starting with current 3rd graders, is it going to be taught K2 as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, our expectation and the assumption is that every kindergartner through 5th grader will take science. We call it that specific content area at the middle school and high school, but in the elementary grades, they're going to touch on all 4 of those core contents progressively throughout the year. So they sort of spiral through all of those different content areas and not exclusive. They still address those science concepts. So 3rd graders will study phases of the moon, and they'll go out and look at those. We have the STAR lab that runs around our district, which is a great opportunity for us kids to look at stars and how the moon phases go. That's one opportunity. So it's going to be at that elementary level, but still the same core ideas. They're still going to look at earth and space science, still life science, but they're going to talk about bugs. Or they're going to, right? So some of those fun things, right?
And one thing I'd like to add to what Ian said, when you looked at the slide with the K-5, it said 3rd grade soft adoption. One thing that we did ask staff, for those staff, even outside of 3rd grade, if they are ready to look at the Discovery Ed resource, they could. So I know there are sites where we have teachers K through 5 that are dipping their toes into the Discovery Ed. So we have students not outside of 3rd grade as well that are getting exposed to our new Discovery Ed resource.
And the structure of the MCAs is going to be the same as it was under the 2009 standards. So when the students take the MCA 4 in 5th grade, they're going to be covering, the concepts that they've been learning throughout elementary school. When they take the middle school science MCA, it will be in 8th grade, and it will cover earth, life, and physical, so that 3-year compilation of science learning in middle school, and then the life science in high school.
My last question is, do we have, at the high school level, is there, if you've taken chemistry and you want to take more chemistry, but you don't want to take AP chemistry, do we have options that are kind of more than just regular classes without having to have the intensity of an AP or IB?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different electives, right? So we're really talking about what requirements do we need for graduation.
Okay.
But there still are all of those electives at the high school level.
That's all.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I do have one. Ian, I don't know if you can answer this easily, but can you summarize, I guess, the difference between the old standards and the new standards? Is there a way to do that, or is that like a whole nother meeting? Because if it's a whole nother meeting.
No, and we could chat, it'd be great. So I think the easiest way to think about it is maybe a real quick explanation of, it used to be we'd come into class and I would just lecture for, hey, this is what the science principles are, and we're going to take a test on it. And then after we do that, we might go in the lab and do an investigation that proves what my lecture said. Now what we do is we flip that and we say, we want to invite you into an exploratory idea. And then later we build the scientific principles from that. And we assess, hey, did you pick up the nuances of what's happening in that experiment? And so it's sort of flipping that. So it's first we investigate and see what's happening, and then we tease out the scientific principles from that, rather than explaining what the scientific principles are. And then if we have time, we do a lab that proves it.
Okay, so the bulk of the difference is more so in the way that the instruction is delivered?
Yes. That might be one key aspect.
Or one key aspect. What about as far as the testing, or I guess confirmation of the child's understanding of the subject material?
So that's going to be more narrative based, right? And so the new standards are really calling out more of a narrative discussion process instead of only calculating what the right answer might be. So there's less. So we went from, and I don't remember the exact number. You might remember, Clasen, but we now are down to 13 standards that are more broad and sort of overarching of what's happening in science, rather than a whole bunch of very specific called out things. So instead of calling out, and I may not be quoting this exactly perfectly, but instead of calling out, you must know the freezing point of water in Celsius, Fahrenheit, Kelvin, now they'll say, hey, do you understand the process of how matter changes as temperature changes?
Anyone else?
I just have a quick question. So if these standards were adopted in 2019, and have there been any school districts that have already started, like the Earth and Space, like surrounding districts, and do we know how that's going?
So it was district decision on how they were going to actually address the Earth and Space science standards. So a particular course has not been required by the state of Minnesota. What the state of Minnesota said is that students must learn and master all of the Earth and Space science. And to be really just frank about it, one of the reasons that they did this and they shifted the middle school was because Earth and Space science was getting diluted. Little standards here in this course and little standards here in this course and this course, and there wasn't really a focus. And so people were saying that they were doing the Earth and Space science standards, but they really weren't. And so when Minnesota went to this framework that they went to, they called out the Earth and Space science standards as a must-do. So there are districts that have, and all of the districts have focused it on 9th grade. A lot because of the shift in the way the middle school course sequence went. Some districts have gone with Earth and Space at a later grade because they wanted to maintain themselves as a physics first district, which means that students would take physics in 9th grade. Some districts have gone to address the Earth and Space science standards through environmental science, where it's a combination of life science and earth and space science. So districts had the leeway to be able to do this differently. We went through, I don't know how many times we talked about how we wanted to actually land on this, and we landed on, you know, because it has been called out. Teachers who teach this course, teachers who teach the earth and space science standards are going to need to be licensed in earth and space science. And so when we were talking about it, it's like you can't really have a bio teacher teach an environmental science class to satisfy the earth and space science standards, because the state says if the majority, whatever the majority of the standards are that are being addressed in the course, is the license that the teacher needs. And so at the end of the day, we said we're going to have an earth and space science class. The standards can fill up an entire course. And so that's how we decided to do it.
One quick clarification there. If you look at the standards, they're called out specifically. So 6th grade is tied to 6th grade. 7th grade is tied to 7th grade. When we get to high school, it just says 9. So the idea, so in other words, we think of maybe as traditionally taking chemistry in 11th grade. The standard for that is still 9. So so in other words, in high school, there's more, I suppose, ambiguity about where you have to teach that particular content. They just say in high school you need to teach it. It'd almost be easier if they said HS. So it's just in high school, but they say 9 for all of them.
So the teachers that, because right now has it been physical science for 9th grade? So the teachers that have been teaching physical science for freshmen, are they suddenly going to be teaching the older students then, and there'll be different teachers that will be teaching the space? Okay.
Yeah, possibly.
There's a big scramble to get licensure for a lot of teachers.
In the state of Minnesota.
We have some teachers that are licensed for earth and space science, but not enough in Minnesota. So we are working with our teachers as well right now to make sure they can get that licensure.
No, that was going to be my question, was that when you said that I didn't know how many earth and space licensed teachers we had, and if that was going to be an issue for, I mean, three high schools worth of 9th graders is a lot of classes.
It's an issue for the state of Minnesota. I think that, all of us here can go to any teacher prep school and say, get an earth and space license, because, you'll be you're in high demand. So is that way, and Pellsby understands this, I think. They are stating that districts will have grace for an undeterminate number of years as teachers get this licensure, because it's an additional certificate, it's an additional license, which means preparation. They have to take the MTLE and they have to pass it in order to get their earth and space science license. So Pellsby is understanding that this is a bigger fish to fry than they may have possibly anticipated.
Any more questions? Seeing none, thank you so much for the information, and I'll look forward to seeing what the MCAs are in the next few years. Hopefully they'll skyrocket. Okay, moving right along is 5.0, which are information items, and 5.1 is our long-range facilities plan, guiding change document, and that will be presented this evening by our Executive Director of Finance and Operations, Dan Pyan.
Thank you. Good evening. As you know, after the August 2022 bond referendum failed, administration began a new long-range facility planning process. Input on the new plan was received by holding 8 community listening sessions and commissioning a community survey. We also had a new demographic study commissioned. And now we've developed a new guiding change document to be used in the new long-range facility planning process. As you recall, guiding change documents are used by the school board when making major changes to a system. So with that, we will go over the guiding change document draft that we're proposing. We'll look for understanding. We'll look for questions and any suggestions. And then we'll bring this back at the next board meeting for approval. Oh, that's financial update. Okay. So if everybody has it in front of them. So the left side, these are our our guide rails as we do our plan. The far left side is the current reality. The far right side is the results that we seek to get from this process. And in the middle are the unacceptable means. So our current reality is in 2015, that was our first shot at increasing the capacities of our high schools and improving our elementary schools. It was the third question of an election, and it failed. So in August 2022, we also went out for a bond, $463 million. That failed also, and that did not pass, and we still had unmet needs to be addressed in our schools and buildings across the school district. As I said before, following the referendum, we had 8 community and staff listening sessions. We held to gather feedback about the results of the election. We also commissioned a community survey by Morris Leatherman Company. There's a link on your guiding change document to review that survey. 500 randomly selected homes in our school boundaries. The survey was completed in December of 2022. Respondents in general said any bond referendum package should prioritize safety and security and space needs of the district's middle and high schools. The district also commissioned a new demographic study, which also is a link in your file with Hazel Reinhardt Consulting. This was completed in January of 2023. Enrollment is projected to increase over the next 5 years. However, the increase is not as great as previously projected. Another reality is that 2 of our high schools are over 90% capacity. And based on the new demographic information, East Ridge High School will be over capacity by at least 400 seats within the next 5 years. Another reality is that 3 of our 4 middle schools are presently over 90% capacity. And based on the new demographic information, Oldman Middle School will be over capacity by at least 200 seats within the next 5 years. 2 of our elementary schools are presently over 90% capacity, and based on the new demographic information, 5 will be over capacity within the next 5 years. We also know that based on MDE school construction guidelines, that current common spaces such as cafeterias in some of our schools are not adequate for the number of students at each site. Career tech education and STEM spaces are inadequate for current instructional needs, and this inadequate space creates safety concerns at many of our schools. Another reality is community education, including our early learning programs, kids club, and adult education has specific space needs that are difficult to meet due to inconsistencies in the number of available classrooms and spaces in our existing schools. Another reality is that special education space is needed due to increased student needs and specialized services. These needs include early childhood special education space, federal setting 4 programming options. Federal setting 4 are self-contained buildings. And our next step pathways transition program space needs expansion and improvement. We also know that our transportation space is not adequate for the number of buses and needs of transportation. We have space needs for the South Washington Alternative High School, which is now actually an alternative learning center. And the district has need for secured entryways at some of our schools and new video surveillance district-wide. So those are our current realities. As we do our planning process, we look to see what our unacceptable means are. Well, actually, let's go to the far right and say, what do we want to get when we're done with this? Well, we want to utilize the information from the demographic report, input from the community and staff to create a 5-year facility plan that prioritizes the needs and takes into consideration the current economic conditions. The district may need to consider boundary school changes and moving students in schools located outside the city where they live. The 5-year look was determined because, as we found in the survey, that it's very difficult for people based on the results of the survey, to grasp a 10-year plan and look out that far. And even 5 years is difficult in these economic times for people to look that far out. But we have to go at least 5 years because it takes 2 to 3 years to build an elementary school and 3 years to build a high school. And we also want to create a funding plan to address the costs of the 5-year facility plan. That would include bonding, lease levies, and LTFM maintenance revenue, LTFM revenue. So the unacceptable means, these are what we're suggesting, the things that we cannot do. We can't ignore the current economic conditions. We can't ignore the input from the community and staff results of the community survey or the updated demographic report. We will not bring forth, this is number 2, we will not bring forth a plan that closes any elementary school. And we will not bring multiple plans forward. So with that, I'd like to put up for discussion and comments or questions. And then if you think that something should be in there that's not, or should be changed, we're certainly here to listen. With that, I'll leave it up to the board.
Okay, are there any questions?
So I had a question around boundary changes and moving students, moving students in schools located outside the city where they live. So one of the things we saw in the survey was parents specifically are opposed to boundary shifts. Is there a way to create a plan, like an efficient plan that doesn't require boundary shifts, or are boundary shifts basically inevitable?
Well, I would like to point out that in our last plan, which obviously was very expensive, that was the goal, to minimize any boundary changes or having students going to a school in a different city. I don't really feel that, with the tax tolerance that we saw in the community survey, that we can really afford to put forth a plan that will eliminate boundary shifts. We'll try, but we can't, I don't know if we can afford to do it based on what the tax tolerance is.
So basically what you're saying is if we don't have more schools to build in those areas, we're going to have to fill ones that have less population in them, meaning children are going to have to shift, most likely.
Yeah, we'll have to look at the resources that would be available based on, what the board and us feel is the amount of money we can ask for, and then we'll have to go backwards and prioritize our needs. And when we're done, we'll have to see where the elementary stand, because that's generally where the boundary shifts appear to be, depending on, what schools get additions or things like that. I mean, in reality, if you look at where the building is happening or is scheduled to happen, a lot of it is right on the border of Woodbury and Cottage Grove. So it's awful tough to plop an elementary school on one side of military and one on the other side of military. But your houses are so close together over there.
With the schools that are below capacity and schools that are at or over capacity, are there, could we, if we shifted children sort of willy-nilly, right? You talk about that as the most efficient way to do the budget, which is why we don't do it, right? But if we shifted children kind of like that, would that be enough to fill, or would that be enough to address the capacity concerns that we have? At elementary specifically.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the round numbers, there's a net vacant seat total in elementary.
Okay.
But then we have to get them there.
Right.
I mean, that's the big thing right now is when we look at the ones that are over capacity and the ones that are under capacity, they're not next door to each other by any means. So you're shifting, and with bus driver shortage, and we can't add any more buses at our current transportation, that we can't add any more buses. I mean, it's kind of becoming, how do we do it? Because obviously, building is the easiest way to, because then you don't have to try and move kids, and you can build where we can get kids that can walk. But when the tax tolerance, as Dan said, is so low, we can't necessarily build anything. It becomes a real struggle as to how we're going to be able to do this and not have the buildings that are currently as full as they are and utilize the ones that are under capacity.
Any more questions? Well,
Do you have what is the, or how long do you estimate this takes, or this is just gonna take how long it takes to do it, to get the plan that we want to put forward? It's just gonna, the timeline is going to be what the timeline is, or do we have like a endpoint in mind?
The endpoint would be, to get construction done as soon as possible, which would require us to do an election in November of this year. So there's regulations on when you have to pass the resolutions for the ballot questions and things like that. So we work backwards from there. So in general, we're looking at, approving the review and comment to be submitted. I believe it's in July or late June.
And I think in terms of plans coming forward, or a plan coming forward, we're looking closer to the end of May. Isn't that correct, Dan? That we would be bringing that back to the board, because we would need an approved plan, and then the board to have conversations around 1 question, 2 questions. What does that look like in terms of stages, phases, et cetera?
So I have a question.
Pat?
Who'll be working on this plan?
Well, there are teams in place. There's a long-range facility plan leadership team. There's a long-range facility plan steering committee. I don't know if we presented the process to the board.
Yeah, the process, we have a row of interested parties where we're going to go back out and get feedback, and I'll talk about one of those in my board report. But this week we met with all of our advisory team members, and that's a vetting group. We'll do our elected officials. We will do community meetings, and so as we go from now to the end of May, we will be going back out and getting feedback. Matter of fact, at this first meeting, when we meet with the community and our advisory groups, the first question we asked was, if you had, or what would you list as your top 3 priorities? Based on the information in the community survey and the demographic report, what would your top 3 priorities be? The answer that the feedback individuals give to us will be the foundation for the first plan, the first draft of a plan we'll create. We haven't started re-looking at a brand new plan until we get some feedback to start that base plan.
So have we had a halt in looking at land for now until we come up with this other plan, or are we still kind of keeping that option where we're exploring it, since I know if we're gonna need something for the buses at least?
I think the difficult part about land, and people have brought this up post-election, is it's really tough to look at and negotiate land when we don't have any dollars. And so it's going to take a successful referendum in order to negotiate. And we can negotiate all we want, but right now, that's kind of what happened. We didn't share where the land was because we didn't know, because we were in negotiations. And so it's really tough to move forward. Dan, I don't know if you would add anything else.
Well, and we also know based on the survey that it's not a big priority for the taxpayers.
Any other questions? Thank you, Dan. Next is 5.2, the revised 22-23 budget review, and that's also be given by Dan Pyan.
Good evening again. School districts revise their budgets annually after student counts, state and federal allocations, and labor expenses are better known. So tonight we'll present you with was the 22-23 revised budget. I want to thank Chris Blackburn and her team for putting this together. This is one of the earliest revised budgets we've done in the last 3-4 years. And then also thank Chris for putting together my presentation because I was running around a lot last week and early this week. I go backwards? I think the batteries must be backwards because the down goes forward and the up goes backwards.
That's the first.
I think Chris changed it on me, and she might have put stuff in slides I didn't pay attention to. Anyway, so what's significant about a revised budget? Well, as I said, we revised budgets due to changes in student counts. We're always projecting. Projections are pretty much always not right. So as we get closer and closer to the end of the year, we know our average daily membership is getting closer and closer to being close to what the final will be. So student counts change, state allocations, some of those change sometimes, and that's based on student counts. Federal allocations change. This year it wasn't too much change. Most of the, there's no more of the coronavirus money coming in. There's a few grants that we've picked up along the way, but not a lot changing now in federal allocations. And then, of course, labor agreements. We've settled a few contracts. The biggest, probably the most important one, not important as far as, but important financially was the paraprofessional contract. So we can take all the new negotiated numbers and put them into the budget. And the biggest thing for me is that when we do the revised budget, it gives me a good indication of the reserves that will be remaining at the end of the fiscal year. And of course, it aids in preparing next year's budget. So here's a summary of our revised budget. The first column is what happened last year. The second column is what the budget we put together that you approved last June. And then the revised budget is one we're asking you to approve at the next board meeting. The revenues on the revised budget are about less than 0.5%, well, less than 20% of a percent. It's 0.13% different. The local revenues going up a little bit, state aids down a little bit, and that's mainly because of special education, not exactly knowing what's going to happen there. Federal aid's about the same in other revenues. On the expense side, we're showing an increase of about less than 0.5%. Salaries and benefits, we're dropping a little bit, about 1%. Benefits, about 3%. The biggest increase, and we'll talk about some of the increases, are in services and supplies. As you know, enrollment drives the budget, especially on the especially on the revenue side. It does drive the budget on the expense side also because of staffing. We staff based on enrollment. But our staffing is done before the year starts, and it doesn't change midway just because classes are set. As we project the enrollment for the future, we use a cohort survival method, very similar to Hazel Reinhardt. These numbers are, just to clarify, are what's considered average daily membership. These are ADMs. And you may look at 2027 and say 19,244, well, and Hazel said 19,199. Well, the difference is that Hazel's counts were K-12 only and were October counts. And my numbers include early childhood special ed, which picks up about 200 ADMs. A few ADMs from VPK and SRP, and then I take ADMs out for PSEO. So she's counting just bodies, but only K through 12 bodies. This is an example of some of the revenues we're looking at. So in this budget, we've increased our enrollment in the budget by about 57 students. This year, and this is what we budgeted, but just so you know, the basic formula increased about 2%, or increased to, not about 2%, but 2% to 6,863. Basic formula revenue. Proposals are out there for the next 2 fiscal years, and they range from 4 and 2 from the governor's budget to many bills that show 5 and 5. And it will be interesting to watch how this all comes to play, and I will keep you updated on what that actually means to us financially. We use per pupil units to figure out our revenues. We also get compensatory dollars. That are compensatory went down for a couple of years, mainly because of the full free meals. People didn't really have to apply. Our free and reduced numbers went down, but now that we've started a direct cert, the state has a direct certification pilot going, our numbers for next year compensatory should be going up. Operating capital comes in based on building ages. Special education is kind of a wild card. We have a pretty good idea of what our special education revenue is, because it's really a reimbursement system. We get about, when all said and done, we get about 55% of our expenses in special ed are reimbursed. There's also a new aid called Special Education Cross-Subsidy Aid. The last time I looked at the special ed revenue that they had projected for us this year was about $35.5 million, and that really wasn't a big increase from the year before. So once they're done calculating, hopefully that will come in a little higher. We get a little bit of English learner aid and gifted and talented aid, not big amounts. On the federal side, we also get special education revenue. Not a lot relative to how big we are. We get Title I, Title II, Title III, and of course there were ESSER funds, and those are almost, few still coming in, but they're almost gone. And just so you know what the other local revenue is operating referendum, which thanks to our voters, we have operating referendum and we have it tied to inflation so that if inflation goes up, that revenue goes up. Local optional revenue, we have LTFM, which is reserved, participation fees, third-party billing, admissions, rentals, and interest. So on the revenue side, as we break it down, we're looking at increasing our local revenue number by about 2.8%. State aids is pretty level because we're, being conservative on special ed. Federal aids dropping a little bit, and these are very conservative numbers, obviously, for revenues, because if we don't want to budget too much, then if it doesn't come in, then we may be overspent. On the expenditure side, by type, as I said before, salaries and benefits are going to go down a little bit, mainly because we've budgeted a lot of positions that, mainly in special ed paras, that just didn't get filled. We did, put in the new revised budget, the new contract, which increased the para wages by about $3 per hour. Services are over budget mainly, and we'll talk about that a little bit, and then supplies. Overall, though, the change in expenditures from the original to the revised budget, percent-wise, wasn't a real big increase. We like to talk about where the money goes. So the last one was about the type of expenditures they were, the objects. This illustration is by program, and of a typical dollar, 46% goes into classroom instruction, direct classroom instruction on the general ed side. Another 20 cents per dollar goes on instruction on the special education side. Student support is not only safety, mental health safety and things like that, but it's also transportation. That's 11 cents of a dollar. We spend about 12 cents of every dollar on maintaining and building facilities. And then district supports 4 cents, administration 3 cents per dollar, and instructional support about 5 cents. So really, when we look at direct involvement with the students, we have about 66 plus the student support of 77, and then the district-wide instruction, about 82 cents goes directly to instruction, and then another 12 cents is to keep the buildings clean and have a place for the kids to go to. So overall, our expenditures increased about 1.1 million from the original budget. The major increases were due to the following. About $400,000 we had to increase our substitute teacher and para-substitute budget. We're kind of looking at a trend. Some of that was that we're trying to, we had to keep our rate high enough to be competitive. We also, the easy one to see is that we had to increase our budget by about $531,000 for snow removal and utilities. Snow removal, we budgeted about $525,000. We've already spent $711,000, and it's going to be about, we're budgeting about $850,000. And then the utilities, I think that's just, we did pretty close on that, but we'll have to increase a little bit, and a lot of that has to do with inflation. On the supply side, we had to increase, we increased our budget by 1.6 million as we anticipate carryover accounts. So the money will be in the reserve if it's not spent, but we have to budget for the carryover so that we can put those dollars. And that's supplies and things that the different school buildings and sites did not spend that they get to carry over. And then we had to budget another $1 million as we're watching some of these curriculum cycles come in. And so that money is coming out of actually an operating capital reserve, but it does go into the budget. And that's to, as we implemented language arts, right? A lot of these increases were offset, as you know, that adds up to more than 1.1 million. They were offset primarily by vacancies in our other budgeted positions. So as we look at our unassigned fund balance, you can see where we were, where we went, and where we went up again. And at this point, based on the budget, and I think if I went back to explain why, I guess I didn't really get. On this slide, you can see the original budget, we were budgeting a surplus of $1,357,521. In the new budget, we're budgeting a surplus of $590,000. So that reduction in what we anticipated, at this point, we're projecting our fund balance to be about 10%. Hopefully the numbers come in a little better than that, but this is a very conservative projection. For the next steps, well, the board will approve this revised budget on March 16th. I do want to point out that in your packet, there are also detailed budgets that show all the different departments and the different funds. And there's also a summary sheet that we designed a while back that summarizes each fund. And we did have school nutrition put together their revised budget. They'll be showing about a $2.1 million surplus at the end of the year, about 17%. Community education revised their budget. They'll be showing about a $1.6 million reserve, and that's about a 12%. So those two funds are doing good, doing fine. We'll have this approved at the next meeting. As we work on the budget, staffing allocations go to the principals. We work on projecting the 23-24 revenues, which is going to be a little tough until the legislature's done. The finance staff will compile all the 23-24 expenses. We'll present the 24 budget to you on June 1st, and then we'll have it approved on June 15th. And then we'll audit the 2022-3, and that'll start in July. So we're always kind of working on 3 different financial periods.
And just one correction, it is actually March 23rd. It's, the board meeting is March 23rd,
Oh.
not March 16th.
Oh, okay.
Katie caught that over here. So just so the board knows and anybody listening
Well,
online.
I'll be here, just,
We know. You just show up here.
yeah, I'll just talk. Any questions?
Hi, Dan, how are you? I had a couple questions. So you mentioned the snow, we have like a rule about the cost per, like the cost to clean after a snowstorm. Can you remind me what it is? It's like X dollars per inch or something like that?
Well, our total snow removal, and this is just, a barometer that we just kind of use. Our total snow removal, including the plowing and then cleaning up the piles and all that stuff, moving around, at this point it's costing us about $11,000 an inch.
$11,000 an inch?
Yeah.
Okay.
So when they're saying 20 inches, I told everybody, well, that's $250,000 we'll never see again. But we only got 19 inches. So.
Yay.
And I will say I give Kyle a lot of credit, Kyle Euchre, because he's very conscious of when the snow's going to come and not putting, we use a contractor for all this, but they're a very close relationship, and not getting them out there too early so they don't do it like twice in a day for no reason. He consults with us to see when school, if it's going to be closed. It's like, well, don't send them out there till 4 o'clock because you're just repeating yourself later on. Then it's a little tough if there's an event or if there's practice or something where they have to get in, but he's really good about kind of watching that stuff. So he's trying to keep the bill down as much as he can.
And then, can you just go over one time that, so I know that there's some lag time between when the local revenue gets levied to taxpayers and when it gets paid to us. So taxpayers who are paying their tax bills now, when does our school district see that money? Because it's not next month, right?
Yeah, the revenue was always in the year after what's called the pay. So pay 23, which is what's being paid now, doesn't count as revenue until fiscal 24.
So after next July. So after next July.
In our revenue, yeah. Yeah, so it's always, so whenever you approve a levy, and I always say this is, like this last levy you approved was called 2022 pay 2023 because you approved it in 2022 in December, but it's for what's being paid by the taxpayers in 23, and then we don't recognize it as revenue until pay 24, till fiscal 24. That's why if you pass a referendum in November for operating levy, you're not going to get your new money until another fiscal year comes up.
And because our levies are based on dollars per student, the money that we're receiving now is based off of last year's average enrollment, correct?
Well, cash-wise, yes, but what they do is they'll just keep adjusting till they get it right. So they'll take, we'll give them projections of what our enrollment's going to be, and then they'll pay based on those projections. But once the enrollments are finalized, they'll go back and adjust those levies. And they'll either increase them or decrease them. And if you look at a levy sheet, they'll show the years that they were adjusting. They'll say general education adjustment, operating levy adjustment for 2022, because they'll finally get the numbers squared up. So they'll square them up eventually.
But then since they're always being in flux, they're always in flux, so like one year gets squared just as the other year starts in flux, correct? Okay.
Yeah.
And then my last question was just about the new accounting standards. Is there any impact on our expenditures or revenue from those new accounting standards, like the capitalizing of leases and stuff like that?
There may be a little adjustment. I mean, there may be a little adjustment not in total dollars spent, but where they're spent. So they'll move from a 500 series, which is capitalize, which is loans, and they'll move into a 300 series, which is rentals and things like that. That's more of a Chris question, but it won't affect the bottom line, but it might affect where they land.
Any additional questions? Okay, thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Next, we have 5.3, the first reading of proposed policy changes, and that will be presented by Julie Nielsen, Superintendent.
Thank you. The following policies being brought forward have been reviewed and revised to reflect updates in Minnesota statute, definition of terms, legal references, and cross-references. Our board policy committee had the opportunity, I believe last week, to review the policies with the individuals bringing the policies forward. And for those watching, current policies are located online. The suggestions for these 7 policies, you'll see policy 302 and 303, both the 300 series, deal with the superintendent, and superintendent selection. You'll see that there are minor changes to both, with the second one having just minor changes related to some of the statutes, through MSBA. When we look at the 400 series policies, we have 4 coming forward. The first one, policies incorporated by references. That policy is in place to note those policies that apply to both students and employees. And you'll see with that policy, there were 1 policy was removed and 2 were added. And so that is according to MSB as well in terms of those policies where there may be overlap. 401, equal employment opportunity. There were some minor grammatical and legal changes. 402 is our non-discrimination disability. There were just updates to legal references. 402.2, non-discrimination, section 504. There was a minor change on who to contact, and I believe that contact is now our Director of Human Resources. And then finally, in the 700 series, policy 704, development and maintenance of an inventory of fixed assets and a fixed asset accounting system, there were some legal and grammatical updates in those policies, or excuse me, in that policy 704. So at this time, I would ask if any other board members have any questions. You go for it, Louise.
Yeah, 401, which is the equal employment opportunity. On the general statement, Part A, it mentions that we're not going to discriminate, and there's a list. The one I don't understand is academic status related to student performance.
There you go, sure. Thank you. It's a good question. So that was added into our district policy. And the mystery is that it's not in our model policy that we look at under MSBA, and that the academic status related to student performance is also not in the Minnesota Human Rights Act. So it's not a protected class that's listed in the Minnesota Human Rights Act. So I'm not certain how that got added in 2020, but we could remove it if the board chooses so. It doesn't fit with the rest of the protected classes.
So I think after talking to Louise today, your recommendation might be that we strike that and we keep the policy according to the Minnesota School Board Association.
Yes.
Any other conversation about that particular one? We'll want to make sure we reflect that change. Thank you for bringing that up. Any others?
Okay.
I believe at this time we have to open it up for public comment, Louise?
Yes. We had a sign up for public comment on policies only, and Bob, did anyone sign up?
Actually,
Sean.
me. Yeah, and nobody did sign up. So
Huh?
no one signed up.
Okay.
One for comments and one for
Roll call.
Right. All right. Next is 6.0, and that's reports and comments, and we will start with our superintendent, Julie Nielsen.
Thank you again. As I shared just a little bit earlier, on Monday evening, we held our first informational session with parents and community members who serve on one of our 11 district advisory teams. So this first kind of go-round was not everybody in the community, but on our 11 advisory teams, we have parents, we have staff, and we have community members. CFAC, we have a couple of just community members. We have board members. Board members were not participating. But it was the opportunity for our 11 advisory teams to come together to hear the presentation around the community survey and the demographic study. Throughout the presentation, and it was a shared presentation where people had different roles, we stopped after the community survey and did a quick check for understanding. Those of you who are teachers, it's like a pop quiz halfway through. And then we went through the demographic update, and after that we did a little pop quiz. Of course, the pop quiz was shared. You could talk to your friends about those answers, but there were some significant parts to the community survey and the demographics. And then finally, as we closed, we talked and we asked them to take a look and think about the information that was in the community survey and the demographic study and get into groups of 3 and talk about what would their 3 highest priorities be. We asked them then to report out as teams, but we also asked them to submit individually. And so that information will be the basis, and of course we're hearing things like, of course, adding on to the high schools. That one probably came up loud and clear, and the rationale from our advisory teams was there was a planned point with both Eastridge and Altman, the 2 schools that are overcrowded, to add on to those schools. That makes sense. And so I would say that if I reflect back, and I don't have the survey data right in front of me, but that was one that almost every group talked about. So we will continue those. We have community sessions. Let me hop to that one. We have our larger community. We heard that we need to make sure that we engage with our community, so we hope that community members who may not have kids in school any longer, or maybe who never had kids in school, attend one of our community meetings. Our communications department sent out postcards, and that will go out to all residents of the district, so board members watch for those. Those meetings are set for March 21st, April 25th, and May 3rd. And we were real intentional about the timing of those, so we have met with our district leaders, our advisory teams, and then we'll go out to the community. Of course, the board is in there as well because we want the board to have that information first. Each of those 3 meetings with the community will have a specific purpose, with the first one focused on what we did with the advisory group this week, where they get the information. The second one is where we'll begin to have some draft plans and some draft options for community members to give us feedback. And then the third meeting, which is May 23rd, will be closer to asking for, what do you think of this final plan altogether? So we're being very intentional about the topics. We don't know what we're bringing forward, but we have an idea in terms of the objectives, but what it will actually look like has not been set. The transportation opt-in window, Dan reported on transportation, and so we're moving ahead with opting in. That window will begin on March 15th and run through March 27th. We actually shortened the window. We didn't think that it was good to keep it open 3 weeks or even 4 weeks, because within that window, those people who did not sign up or did not complete the opt-in, then we have a way to go back and just track that group and communicate. Each meeting, will begin, it will be important that all families log into campus and provide the school district with information about busing. With this information that we gather, we will be able to determine the most efficient routes for students and work towards stabilizing the cancellation of future routes. If board members aren't aware, we had to cancel additional routes last week, and so we may not be hearing from parents, but it continues to be a concern in our community. And then next, the board and executive cabinet spent last night finalizing a draft of the mission, vision, core values, and strategic priorities. Moving forward, the district will be going out and getting additional feedback on what was drafted by the board last night. And then finally, for everyone here, the school district is on spring break next week, all of next week. That doesn't mean we're closed down. It means that there are still certain groups that are absolutely at work. But we wish our families and our students a nice week off, hopefully resting and a little sun.
Thank you, Julie. Next, we'll take school board committee reports, and I'd like for, when I call on you, to tell what committee and if you have any updates. So we'll begin with Melinda Doles.
Yeah, so I missed the 9/16 meeting last night because I was here for the strategic planning, but I just wanted to remind everybody that if you're interested in having tours of any of the 9/16 building sites, there's tours available on March 22nd and April 12th, and there's a link that Dana had sent us that she forwarded from 9/16. If you want to sign up for those, there's some really neat to see those different places. And I'm on a new committee, SEAC or SEEK. So that was Tuesday night, and we were introduced to an online called Help Me Connect. It's an online navigator for parents of young children or any community members, people with young children that, or pregnant as well, to help them get connected to resources in the community. So, and that website is helpmeconnect.org if anyone wants to explore that. So.
Thank you, Melinda. Pat? That's okay.
Okay, so Metro XU is an elected position, and you represent not just this district, but 3 or 4 other communities of districts. And if you want to apply for that, you should be getting an email. I got mine at home, but I just looked on this email and it's not there. So I'll talk to Dana and see where it is. You should be getting that. So if you're interested in that, those meetings are 5 times a year and they're paid. So you do get a stipend. They're looking for more board representatives, and they're looking for 3 superintendent representatives.
Thank you, Pat. Louise?
Curriculum Advisory Committee met, very similar to what you saw tonight with the CERC process, but also including what's going on with math and ELA.
Okay. Katie? Okay. Eric?
Yeah, I'm on the curriculum committee with Louise, so she covered that, as well as the AMSD, or I'm on that committee as well. And I have not, and I apologize, I haven't been able to make it to one of those meetings because they're at a horrible time at 7:30 in the morning. But Pat informed me that they record those, so thank God for that. I will.
You'll be checking them out, right?
I will check them out that way, most likely, because that's bad for me. So. But anyway, that's it.
Okay, thanks. Sydney?
Sure. Well, as we heard, CFAC didn't happen this past month because CFAC members were at the meeting Monday night with Julie and the rest of the cabinet. And our Achievement and Integration committee meeting was snowed out, so we weren't able to have it, and we'll be meeting next in, I think, April?
April.
Yes. We did have a meeting with the City of Woodbury, which is one of the committees I sit on, and we just talked a lot about kind of what they're seeing in terms of development and where they're seeing the community go. And, you know, it was just mostly information sharing and talking a lot about, you know, issues that we see in the school district and what they're seeing from their side.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and we also, as you all know, submitted our equity and integration plan. So that's been, and we will hear more from James at some point. Also, the Woodbury Racial Justice Committee met, and today they had a presentation to the community, and I missed that because I had to be here. So I'll have to report back next time. Did you go at 2 o'clock?
No, not to that one.
Oh,
No,
okay.
it's at the online
That was the
one.
one Tracy
No.
was,
That's not a committee through this, though.
the subcommittee. Yeah. And then I missed the SoWashCo. Do you have anything to report on that? Did you, Bob, did you attend the last meeting? SoWashCo cares.
Yeah, SoWashCo cares. You were at a different meeting that night that we
Yeah.
found each other at. A couple of the big things, they did receive a grant from Marathon for operations of approximately $80,000, which will be great because it'll help cover some cost of space. And they're going to partner with Basic Needs in St. Paul Park to rent some of the space in their facility, which will be a good partnership. Working on employee recognition coming up and launching a new website.
Thanks for attending that. I always enjoy being with you, listening to you. So 7.0 are our future meeting dates. Our next meeting will be a business meeting on March 23rd, 2023, then a workshop meeting on April 6th, 2023. Those meetings will be held at 6 p.m. here at the District Service Center. And now we are at 8.0 and we are adjourned.